Hi, so I'm gonna start with the Danish girl, the article in week 10, I think it was, about it. So I didn't really understand what it meant by death drive, so I went to go look it up myself. And the definition I found described it as a drive towards death and destruction, often expressed through behaviors such as aggression, repetition, compulsion, and self-destructiveness. And so the article was mostly talking about repetition, about how the main character kept repainting the same landscape over and over again. And one of the other quotes from it, from the article, is like kind of describing the way that repetition and like repressed memories kind of works. It in the article said he is obliged rather to repeat as a current experience what is repressed instead of, as the physician would prefer to see him do, recollecting it as a fragment of the past. So this article kind of confused me. I didn't exactly understand what it was trying to say about the death drive and about the movie. For me, I also don't really understand what the exact meaning of the repetition of the painting was, because in the movie, the main character was saying about how she felt like it wasn't finished yet. And I kind of saw that as a representation of that they haven't fully discovered themselves yet. And so to me, it kind of felt, for the movie, the repetition that I saw was the repetition of self-discovery, constantly, like Lily coming in and out, until finally she stayed. And so I feel like I probably got the wrong idea from this article, because with the death drive saying how like it's a drive towards death because of that repetition, it kind of, to me, sounds like that's saying that it was Lily's constant reappearance that eventually led to her death, which I can see it can be true, because she did die because of the surgery, but I didn't see that as like an active reach towards death. And to me, the article kind of framed it as if that was like a reach towards death, like an unconscious reach towards death, which I don't really agree with. But I have a feeling that I'm probably just reading the article wrong and interpreting it wrong. And then in the article, in week 11, titled, I'm just looking at the title right now, if it would load. Sorry, I can't find the title. Sexual choice and sexual act. There was a lot of interesting things that I found in it. Just reading my notes real quick. I thought it was interesting how it talked about the idea of if homosexuality can be considered a social class, and how in the article they mentioned that there is like a collective consciousness, kind of like how there is with labor workers, and they undergo, as it said, numerous transformations. So I thought that was interesting how it kind of can be seen as like its own. I kind of see it less as a social class and more just like as a group of individuals. I don't really know what the difference between a social class and just like a group of people is, because for me, class, whenever I hear class, I kind of think more of economic wise. And then, sorry, just reading the notes. I also thought it was interesting about how they were talking about, so I'm just going to read a quote from it. In other words, it isn't that homosexuals are deviants who should be allowed to practice in peace, but rather that the whole conceptual scheme which categorizes homosexuals as deviants must be dismantled. I thought that was really interesting about how it's talking about not really just allowing for these sexual choices to be allowed, but more just taking away the like kind of discrimination against homosexuality, about people just wanting to be with the same gender or whoever they want to be with, and saying that it's not exactly just allowing to let the people choose who they want to choose, but as a society kind of getting rid of the stigma that these people are deviants, that they're going away from the norm, kind of implying like, why can't we just change what we perceive as the norm? And I feel like that could be a lot more effective in like decreasing hate and stuff if people are just more accepting in general, instead of just being like, yeah, we'll allow it. Instead, work to change their viewpoint as not just seeing it something as allowed, but something that, why should it be repressed in the first place? And then they also talked about for a little bit about teachers, and saying like that whole debate of like some people believe that homosexuals shouldn't be teachers because they're going to end up teaching the youth about homosexuality. And in the article, in the interview, they're kind of saying that like, what's the difference between what heterosexuals are already doing, spreading their beliefs and of what homosexuality is. Like, it creates that creates harm in itself. I'm just going to read my notes real quick. It says, quoting from an article, it says, well, let me ask you about this. Do you believe that teachers who for years, for decades, for centuries, explained to children that homosexuality is intolerable, do you believe that the textbooks that purged literature and falsified history in order to exclude various types of sexual behavior have not caused ravages at least as serious as a homosexual teacher who speaks about homosexuality and who can do no more harm than explain a given reality, a lived experience? And so I thought that was a really good point that they're making, that there's already harm being done with teachers, heterosexual teachers, or just teachers in general, who do spread like their own judgment against homosexuals. And so saying like they are doing harm, and so what more can a homosexual teacher do other than, just talk about their truth? That's not teaching kids to think really, that's not teaching kids to be homosexual. It's just teaching kids about different types of people in the world. And so I thought that stood out to me because that's a debate that I've heard a lot throughout the years, about just people not wanting, like with the thing. It kind of reminds me of how some parents claim that watching SpongeBob will make you gay somehow. It kind of reminds me of that same mindset of, just because there may be a gay person, a gay character, that it's not trying to push some agenda onto children or onto people. It's just an expression of different people in the world. And so I personally can't understand why people are so against that. But yeah, so that's something I found interesting. And then I also read in this article that they started mentioning things in ancient Greece, and that reminded me of things that I was learning in one of my other classes. One of my classes is about, I have a class in like the history of love and erotica throughout history. And in that class, it talked about how ancient Greece, that homosexuality wasn't really like a punishable thing, and how it was kind of like a norm. It was a way for like one of the common things that we talked about was that there would be like an older man, a mentor, and a younger boy, and they would have like a sexual relationship teaching them things. And while that's not okay today because, you know, younger kid, it's not consensual, but how it was interesting to me about how like just the what's the word, how back then it wasn't really seen as a taboo in certain cultures, but somehow in our current culture and current today, homosexuality is still seen as like this unforgivable sin somehow. So it's kind of weird to me and interesting how history evolved to that point. And then just a last little mention, I also thought it was interesting about, they were talking about the difference between heterosexual and homosexual literature, and talking about how in homosexual literature it kind of seems that a lot of the stuff is more explicit. And one of the quotes I saw for that was, so the more free and open sexual practice is, the more one can afford to be reticent or oblique in talking about it. And that's referring to heterosexual, about how heterosexual literature is more tame. There can be cuts and just mentions because it's free. You already can assume what's going to happen. And then one of the people in the interview talked about how homosexual literature is more explicit because there's also not that same sense of courtship, because as they said, homosexuals were not allowed to elaborate a system of courtship because the cultural expression necessary for such an elaboration was denied them. And so I thought that was really interesting about how like it even affects literature and the sexuality shown in literature, because since courtship wasn't allowed, there's not really much of like in gay literature, you find that it's a lot more explicit because there really wasn't much courtship. It's more getting down to talking about the I can't really think about the word for it, but just the more explicit nature, the more fiery stuff, I guess you could say. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and those are my notes.